Some secrets follow us to the grave, leaving the ones we love most to wonder what we kept locked away in our hearts. For 68-year-old Marlene, that wondering was about to end in the most unexpected way imaginable. She stood before the old barn doors with trembling hands, holding the key to the one place her husband Harold had forbidden her to enter for 35 years of marriage. 2 years after his death, she finally found the courage to discover what he'd been hiding. Inside wasn't rusted equipment or forgotten junk. It was an art studio filled with paintings of their life together. But one final canvas would reveal a secret so deep it brought her to her knees. What had Harold painted that would change everything Marlene thought she knew about their marriage? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the farmhouse where Marlene had lived for 43 years. At 68, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to pace herself, her silver hair pinned back in the same practical bun she'd worn since her teaching days. The house felt too large now, its rooms echoing with memories of a life shared with Harold, her husband of 35 years, who had passed 2 winters ago. Their farm in rural Ohio had once been a thriving operation, 200 acres of corn and soybeans, a modest dairy herd, and vegetable gardens that supplied half the county with fresh produce at the Saturday market. Now, financial necessity had reduced it to the house, the old red barn, and the last 20 acres surrounding them. The rest had been sold off piece by piece after Harold's funeral expenses and medical bills had taken their toll on her modest teacher's pension. Marlene poured her second cup of coffee and settled into Harold's favorite chair by the kitchen window, the one with the clear view of the barn. This had become her morning ritual, sitting in his spot, watching the sunrise paint the weathered wood of that mysterious building. For 35 years of marriage, that barn had been Harold's domain, as off-limits to her as a locked diary. Some spaces need to remain sacred, Marlene, he would say whenever her curiosity got the better of her. A man needs a place to think his own thoughts. She had respected his wish, even when it stung. Even when she noticed him spending entire evenings out there, emerging only when she called him for supper, his hands sometimes stained with colors she couldn't identify, not the usual grease and dirt of farm work, but something else entirely. When she'd ask about the stains, he'd simply wash his hands at the kitchen sink and change the subject to the weather or the crops. The kitchen phone rang, interrupting her reverie. Emma Kowalski's cheerful voice filled the quiet house. "Morning." "Marlene, just checking to see if you need anything from town today. I'm heading to Miller's for groceries." Emma lived on the adjacent property, a widow herself at 72, though she'd been alone nearly twice as long as Marlene. The two women had grown closer since Harold's passing, their shared understanding of empty houses and quiet suppers creating an unspoken bond. "Thank you, dear, but I'm well stocked," Marlene replied, though she appreciated the daily check-ins more than she let on. "How's your arthritis treating you?" "Oh, you know how it is. Some days better than others. The rain last night has my knees complaining." Emma paused, and Marlene could hear the concern creeping into her voice. "You've been mighty quiet lately. Everything all right over there?" Marlene's eyes drifted back to the barn. 3 days ago, while cleaning out Harold's old toolbox in the basement, she discovered something that had shaken her to her core. Tucked beneath a false bottom, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, was a key she'd never seen before. It was old brass, ornate in a way that didn't match any of the utilitarian locks around the farm, except one, the barn. She'd tried it yesterday evening, her hands shaking as she approached the weathered doors. The key had turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting all this time, but she hadn't had the courage to push open those doors. "Not yet. I'm fine, Emma. Just thinking about Harold more than usual lately." "Well, that's natural. Grief doesn't follow any timetable, you know. 2 years, 20 years. The heart remembers when it wants to remember. After hanging up, Marlene walked through the house, her footsteps echoing in rooms that had once bustled with activity. The living room still held Harold's impression in his favorite recliner, the fabric worn smooth by decades of evening news watching. His reading glasses remained on the side table next to a farming magazine from 3 years ago, as if he might return at any moment to finish the article about crop rotation. Their bedroom upstairs felt like a shrine. She'd changed nothing his. Clothes still hung in the closet. His aftershave still sat on the dresser. Sometimes she would spray a small amount on his pillow just to remember the way he smelled. When he'd pull her close during those early morning hours before the farm work began, the house held evidence of a good marriage. She supposed 43 years in the same place, 35 of them together. Harold had been a kind man, reliable and steady as the seasons. He'd never raised his voice to her, never forgotten her birthday, never failed to tell her dinner was delicious, even when the roast was overcooked or the biscuits burned. But there had been distances between them too, spaces in their marriage that neither of them had known how to bridge. The silence that grew after they'd learned they couldn't have children. The way Harold would disappear into his own thoughts during dinner, his eyes distant and unreachable. The nights when she'd wake to find his side of the bed empty and see the light on in the barn through their bedroom window. "What do you think about out there?" She'd asked him once, early in their marriage. "Nothing much," he'd replied. "Just planning tomorrow's work." But she'd seen the way he looked when he returned from those midnight visits to the barn. Not tired like a man who'd been planning crop rotations, but peaceful in a way she rarely saw during his waking hours. Almost content, as if he'd found something in that building that eluded him in the house they shared. Her son David called every Sunday evening from Seattle, where he worked as an engineer for Boeing. He was a good son, dutiful in his weekly check-ins, but their conversations never ventured beyond the surface of things. How was her health? Was she eating enough? Did she need money for repairs or groceries? He'd offered repeatedly to move her closer to him and his family, but she couldn't imagine leaving the farm, leaving Harold's presence that still lingered in every corner of their life together. "You're too isolated out there, Mom," David had said during their last conversation. "What if something happens? What if you fall or get sick?" She understood his concern, but how could she explain that isolation felt different than loneliness? That she found comfort in the routine of her days, in maintaining the rhythms Harold had established? The morning coffee in his chair, the afternoon walk to check the mailbox, the evening ritual of turning on the porch light even though no one was coming home. Pete Morrison, the local handyman who'd helped Harold with repairs over the years, still stopped by occasionally to check on things. He was 63, a gentleman who'd never married, and he had the kind of quiet understanding that didn't require many words. Last month, he'd noticed a loose board on the front steps and fixed it without being asked, refusing payment beyond a glass of her sweet tea. Harold always said this place had good bones, Pete had told her as he packed up his tools. He'd want it kept up proper. The afternoon stretched ahead of her, empty as they all seemed lately. She could call David, but it was only Tuesday, and their routine was Sundays. She could drive to town for groceries she didn't need, or visit the library where she'd worked for 15 years before retiring. But increasingly, her thoughts returned to that key and the mystery it might unlock. What had Harold been doing in that barn all those years? What had filled his evenings and stolen him from their bed on restless nights? The questions had been manageable when he was a live curiosity, tempered by respect for his privacy. But now, with only memories to keep her company, the not knowing had become a weight she carried through each quiet day. She remembered their wedding day, 37 years ago now. Harold had been 33, she 31, older than most couples starting out. both of them having waited for the right person rather than settling for convenience. He'd been handsome in his simple way, tall and lean with gentle brown eyes, and hands that spoke of honest work. She'd worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and they'd been married in the little Methodist church in town with just their immediate families in attendance. Their honeymoon had been 3 days at a cabin on Lake Erie, where they'd walked the shore and planned their future together. Harold had dreams of expanding the farm, maybe raising cattle alongside the crops. She'd wanted to teach, to fill their house with children's laughter and help young minds discover the world through books and learning. Some dreams had come true. She'd gotten her teaching position at the elementary school and had loved every minute of her 30 years there. Harold had built the farm into something to be proud of, respected by his neighbors for his hard work and fair dealing. But the children they'd planned for had never come. Despite years of trying and hoping and eventually accepting medical advice that nothing was wrong, sometimes these things just weren't meant to be. That acceptance had changed something between them, though neither had spoken of it directly. They'd grown gentler with each other, more careful, as if they were both made of something fragile that might break if handled too roughly. Their love had endured, but it had become quieter, more like a steady flame than the bright fire of their early years. And through it all, Harold had maintained his mysterious relationship with that barn. Now, sitting in the kitchen as shadows lengthened across the farmyard, Marlene fingered the key in her apron pocket. She'd carried it with her for 3 days, the brass warm from her touch, its weight both insignificant and enormous. Tonight, she decided. Tonight she would finally learn what Harold had been hiding from her all these years. The sun was setting by the time she made her way across the yard, the key clutched in her palm like a talisman. The barn loomed before her, its red paint faded to a dusty rose, its windows too high and small to reveal any secrets within. Harold had kept it in good repair. The roof was sound, the doors hung straight on their hinges. Whatever lay inside had been protected from weather and time. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. It turned easily, as if recently oiled, and the heavy doors swung open with barely a creak. What she found inside would change everything she thought she knew about the man she'd loved for 35 years. The barn was not filled with rusted farm equipment or forgotten machinery. Instead, soft evening light revealed something impossible, something beautiful, something that took her breath away and brought tears to her eyes before she could even fully comprehend what she was seeing. Harold's wedding ring sat on a small wooden table near the entrance, as if he'd removed it each time he came here, as if this space required a different version of himself than the one who shared her bed and table. And everywhere on easels, propped against walls, hanging from rough-hewn beams were paintings. Dozens and dozens of paintings that chronicled a life she recognized and yet had never truly seen. Asterisk. Marlene stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. This wasn't a storage space or workshop. This was an artist's studio, complete, professional, and carefully maintained. Natural light filtered through skylights Harold must have installed without her knowledge, illuminating canvases that seemed to glow with life and color. Her breath caught as she recognized the first painting directly in front of her. It was Harold himself, but not the Harold she had known. This was a self-portrait of a man with paint-stained fingers and intense, focused eyes that held a depth of emotion she had rarely seen in their daily life together. He had painted himself as an artist, and the skill evident in every brushstroke spoke of years, perhaps decades, of dedicated practice. "Oh, Harold," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sacred space. "What were you doing out here all those years?" She stepped deeper into the studio, her footsteps muffled by canvas drop cloths that covered the wooden floor. The smell hit her, then linseed oil, turpentine, and the earthy scent of dried paint. It was the smell that had sometimes clung to Harold's clothes, the one she had never been able to identify, but had accepted as another farm-related mystery. To her left, an entire wall was dedicated to paintings of their farmhouse through the seasons. Spring scenes showed the old maple tree in full bloom, its branches heavy with pink blossoms she remembered from their early years together. Summer paintings captured the vegetable garden at its peak, rows of tomatoes and corn stretching toward a horizon painted in shades of gold and amber. Fall scenes depicted the harvest, the combine cutting through fields of grain while storm clouds gathered overhead. Winter paintings showed the house blanketed in snow, warm yellow light glowing from the kitchen window where she had waited for Harold to come in from his evening chores. But as beautiful as these landscapes were, they weren't what took her breath away. Along the opposite wall hung portraits, dozens of them, and every single one was of her. Marlene moved toward them like a sleepwalker, each painting revealing moments from their life together that she had forgotten or perhaps never fully appreciated. There she was at 32, laughing as she hung laundry on the line, her hair caught by the wind and her summer dress billowing around her legs. Another showed her at the kitchen sink, morning light streaming through the window and illuminating her face as she hummed while washing dishes. One painting stopped her cold. It depicted her sitting in the porch swing on a summer evening, reading a book while fireflies danced in the gathering dusk. She remembered that evening Harold had said he was going to check on the cattle, but he must have been out here instead, capturing the scene from memory or perhaps sketching it quickly before returning to translate it into paint. The technical skill evident in every piece amazed her. These weren't the fumbling attempts of a hobby painter. The brushwork was confident, the color choices sophisticated, the composition of each piece thoughtfully planned. Harold had been genuinely talented, more than talented. He had been gifted with an artist's eye and a master's hand. How had she lived with him for 35 years and never known? She found a small wooden stool and sat heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Harold's secret life. All those evenings when he'd claimed to be checking equipment or planning the next day's work, he'd been here, painting their life together, seeing her through eyes that apparently found her beautiful and worthy of endless artistic attention. Tears began to flow then, a mixture of wonder and hurt that she couldn't untangle. The wonder came from seeing herself through Harold's eyes, not the aging woman she saw in the mirror each morning, but someone luminous and cherished, someone whose every movement was worth preserving in oil and canvas. The hurt came from the realization that this part of Harold, this creative, passionate, deeply observant part, had been hidden from her completely. Why hadn't he shared this with her? Why had he felt the need to keep such beauty secret? She rose and continued her exploration, drawn to a corner where several easels held works in various stages of completion. One canvas showed their bedroom window during a thunderstorm, rain, streaking the glass while lightning illuminated the curtains she had sewn during their second year of marriage. Another depicted her hands kneading bread, the flour dusty on her fingers, and the kitchen counter scattered with the evidence of her morning baking. But it was the third easel that made her sink back onto the stool, her hand pressed to her chest as if to steady her racing heart. The painting was unfinished, just the beginning sketches of what would have been another portrait of her. But in the corner of the canvas, Harold had written something in his careful script. My beloved Marlene, 43 years of mornings. How do I paint the way you hum while you cook our breakfast? How do I capture the grace you don't know you possess? The words blurred as fresh tears fell. Harold had been romantic deeply, profoundly romantic in a way she had never suspected. Their marriage had been good, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, but it had never felt particularly passionate. They'd been practical people, farmers who worked hard and loved quietly. At least, that's what she had believed. This studio told a different story entirely. This was the workspace of a man who had been desperately, beautifully in love with his wife, who had spent decades trying to capture and preserve every moment of their shared life. The Harold who had painted these works was not the steady, predictable man who had discussed crop prices over breakfast. This Harold was an artist, a romantic, a man with a rich inner life that he had somehow felt compelled to hide. She discovered a small notebook tucked between two canvases, its pages filled with Harold's handwriting. The entries were dated, spanning back nearly 30 years. She opened it randomly and read, June 15th, 1994. Painted Marlene in the garden today. She was deadheading the roses, and the afternoon light caught the silver beginning to show in her hair. She's growing more beautiful as she ages, but I don't think she sees it. How do I tell her what I see without sounding foolish? How do I explain that watching her tend those flowers makes my chest ache with love? Marlene's hand shook as she turned the pages, finding entry after entry that revealed Harold's thoughts and feelings about their life together. Here was evidence of a deep emotional life that he had somehow never felt able to share with her directly. Asterisk. October 3rd, 1998. Bad storm last night. Marlene made hot chocolate, and we sat by the fire. She fell asleep in my arms, and I wanted to memorize the moment, the way her hair smelled like the lavender soap she makes, the weight of her head on my shoulder, the trust in her sleeping face. Started a new painting this morning, but how do you paint contentment? How do you capture the feeling of being exactly where you belong? The notebook slipped from her fingers as she understood, finally, why Harold had never told her about his art. It wasn't that he didn't trust her or didn't want to share this part of himself. It was that this studio was his love letter to her, his way of processing and preserving feelings that were too big, too overwhelming for ordinary words. Harold had been shy about his emotions, she realized now. He'd never been the type to make grand romantic gestures or speak poetry about his feelings, but he'd been pouring all of that unexpressed love onto canvas, creating a secret gallery that celebrated their marriage in ways he could never have articulated out loud. The light was fading now, and she would need to return to the house soon. But first, she walked slowly around the studio one more time, seeing it now not as a betrayal or deception, but as Harold's most intimate gift, one he had somehow planned for her to find after his death. Near the door, she noticed a covered canvas. That was different from the others. Something about the way Harold had positioned it, slightly apart from his other work, suggested special significance. She approached it carefully and lifted the cloth that draped it, revealing Harold's final painting. It was a portrait of her standing in this very studio, surrounded by his life's work, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the depth of his love. He had painted her discovery before it happened, had somehow known that she would find this place, and had wanted to capture the moment when she finally saw herself through his eyes dot at the bottom of the canvas. In Harold's familiar script were the words, "My darling Marlene, I hope you can forgive an old man's shyness. This is how I loved you. This is how I will always love you." Marlene sank to her knees before the painting, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Harold's final gift. Everything she thought she knew about their marriage, about Harold himself, had been transformed in the space of an hour. She wasn't just a widow mourning a good man. She was a woman who had been cherished beyond measure by an artist whose greatest masterpiece had been their life together. Asterisk. Marlene returned to the studio the next morning, carrying a cup of coffee and Harold's old reading glasses, which she'd found in his nightstand drawer. The early light streaming through the skylights transformed the space once again, revealing details she'd missed in her emotional overwhelm the evening before. She settled onto the wooden stool and began a more systematic exploration of Harold's secret world. She started with the paintings arranged chronologically along the east wall, their life together told through Harold's eyes, beginning with their wedding day. The first canvas showed her in her mother's altered dress, but not the formal posed photograph that sat on their mantel. Instead, Harold had painted her laughing during the reception, her head thrown back in genuine joy as his cousin told one of his terrible jokes. He'd captured a moment of pure happiness that the official wedding photographer had somehow missed. The next painting showed their honeymoon cabin at Lake Erie. But again, Harold had chosen an intimate moment over the obvious, scenic view. He'd painted her silhouette in the cabin window at dawn, wrapped in his shirt as she watched the sunrise over the water. She remembered that morning. Harold had said he was going for an early walk on the beach, but he must have been outside the cabin instead, sketching her without her knowledge. Even then, she whispered to the empty studio, "You were watching me like this." Each painting revealed layers of observation and tenderness she'd never suspected. There was the canvas showing her unpacking boxes in their first apartment above, Miller's Hardware, before they'd saved enough to buy the farm. Harold had captured her standing amid the chaos of their belongings, holding her grandmother's china teacup and looking lost. She remembered feeling overwhelmed that day, uncertain if she was ready for married life. And somehow Harold had seen that vulnerability and preserved it with gentle understanding. Another painting stopped her, breath entirely. It depicted her, sleeping on a Sunday afternoon, curled on their old sofa with a book fallen open across her chest. The afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains created patterns across her skin, and Harold had rendered each shadow with loving precision. She touched her face unconsciously, trying to see herself as Harold had seen her, not the practical farm wife she believed herself to be, but someone worthy of such devoted artistic attention. But it was a smaller canvas, tucked between two larger works that brought tears to her eyes. Harold had painted her hands as she worked in the garden during their second spring together. Her fingers were dirty from planting tomato seedlings, her wedding ring catching the morning light. The painting was titled in Harold's careful script, "Marlene's Hands, May 1989, Building Our Future, One Seed at a Time." She studied her painted hands, remembering how proud she'd been of that first garden, how Harold had praised her green thumb even when half the plants had failed. He'd seen potential in her fumbling attempts at farming, had witnessed her determination to make their new life work, and had somehow understood that those dirty hands represented her commitment to their shared dreams. The emotional weight of seeing herself through Harold's eyes was overwhelming. For 35 years, she'd lived with her own harsh self-assessments, too tall, too serious, growing older and less attractive with each passing season. But Harold's paintings revealed a different woman entirely, graceful, beautiful, endlessly fascinating to the man who'd shared her days, and somehow found poetry in her most ordinary moments. She discovered Harold's painting journal tucked between two easels, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The earliest entries dated back to their second year of marriage, written in Harold's younger handwriting but already showing the careful observation that would characterize his later work. April 12, 1989. Marlene planted the garden today. I wanted to help, but she shooed me away, said she needed to figure it out herself. Watched from the kitchen window as she consulted that old farming manual, measuring rows with a piece of string. She's so determined to make everything perfect. Don't think she realizes how beautiful she looks when she's concentrating, the way she bites her lower lip when she's thinking hard. The entry continued. Started a sketch of her hands after she came in for lunch. There's dirt under her fingernails and a blister forming on her thumb, but I've never seen anything more lovely. How do I paint determination? How do I capture the way she attacks every challenge like it's a puzzle to be solved? Marlene turned the pages, finding entry after entry that revealed Harold's deep attention to her daily life. He'd noticed things she'd forgotten. The way she hummed while cooking breakfast, how she always checked the locks twice before bed, the ritual of hanging laundry that she'd inherited from her mother. Each observation was recorded with the eye of an artist and the heart of a devoted husband. June 3, 1991. Marlene fell asleep reading again. Found her in the chair by the window, book on her lap, glasses sliding down her nose. She looked so peaceful, so trusting. Sometimes I think she's the bravest person I know. The way she throws herself into everything. Teaching those children, caring for the farm, loving me even when I'm not good with words. Started a new painting tonight. Want to show how safe she makes this house feel. She found the painting he'd referenced, a tender portrait of her sleeping in the chair that still sat by their bedroom window. The late afternoon light illuminated her face, and Harold had somehow captured not just her physical appearance, but the sense of contentment that had settled over their life during those early years. Before the disappointments and compromises of longer marriage had worn away some of their initial joy, the realization hit her. Suddenly, Harold had been documenting their happiness, preserving the moments when their love felt new and full of possibility. He'd been creating a record of their best selves, the people they'd been before life's inevitable challenges had taught them to expect less, hope more carefully, protect themselves from too much vulnerability. Another section of paintings showed their attempts to start a family. Harold had painted her reading pregnancy books, her face hopeful and glowing with anticipation. Another showed her emerging from Dr. Patterson's office after yet another disappointing appointment. Her shoulders set with determination, but her eyes revealing the growing fear that children might never come. The most heartbreaking painting in this series showed her sitting on their bed after the doctor had finally delivered the news they'd both been dreading. There was no medical reason they couldn't conceive, but sometimes these things simply didn't happen. Harold had painted her from behind, her posture conveying a grief too deep for tears. The title read, Marlene Processing Dreams Deferred, September 15th, 1994. She remembered that day with painful clarity. They'd driven home in silence, each lost in private disappointment. She'd sat on the bed for an hour, staring at the room. They'd optimistically prepared as a nursery, trying to accept that it would remain a guest room indefinitely. Harold had disappeared. She'd assumed to do evening chores, but now she understood he'd come here to process his own grief through paint and canvas. The journal entry for that day was brief but devastating. How do you paint the sound of dreams breaking? How do you capture the moment when hope becomes acceptance? Marlene is stronger than she knows, but I see the sadness she tries to hide. We'll be enough for each other. We have to be. Reading Harold's private thoughts about their shared disappointments, Marlene began to understand why he'd never shared his art with her. This studio wasn't just a creative outlet, it was where he processed the difficult emotions that neither of them had known how to discuss openly. Their generation hadn't been raised to examine feelings or talk through problems. They'd been taught to accept what couldn't be changed and find meaning in what remained. Harold had found his meaning in documenting their love, in creating beauty. From their ordinary days, in seeing her through eyes that found grace in her smallest gestures. This studio was proof that their quiet marriage had been deeper and more passionate than she'd ever suspected. Harold simply hadn't known how to express that passion in words. 3 days had passed since Marlene's first discovery of the studio, and she found herself spending most of her waking hours in the barn, methodically working through Harold's artistic legacy. She'd established a routine: morning coffee with Harold's journal, afternoons studying the paintings, evenings sitting quietly among his easels as the light faded through the skylights he'd so carefully installed. On this particular morning, she discovered a section of the studio she'd initially overlooked, a corner where several canvases leaned against the wall, covered by a paint-stained drop cloth. When she pulled away the covering, her breath caught. These paintings were different from the others, darker in tone and subject matter, depicting scenes that spoke to deeper sorrows. The first canvas stopped her cold. It showed an empty bedroom painted in soft yellows and greens, the room they'd prepared as a nursery during their 3rd year of marriage. Harold had painted it exactly as she remembered, the rocking chair her mother had given them, the hand-sewn quilts folded in the hope chest, the mobile of farm animals hanging motionless over a crib that would never hold their child. But this wasn't a painting of hope or anticipation. Harold had captured the room after they'd finally accepted their childlessness, when the space had become a monument to dreams that would never be realized. Dust motes floated in the afternoon sunlight, and everything looked frozen in time, waiting for a purpose that would never come. The painting was titled simply, "The Room That Might Have Been." 1995. Marlene sank onto her familiar stool, overwhelmed by the realization that Harold had shared her grief more deeply than she'd ever known. During those difficult years when they'd struggled with their infertility, he'd seemed to accept their situation with typical male stoicism. He'd been the one to suggest they stop trying, to focus on the good things in their life rather than mourning what they couldn't have. She'd sometimes resented his apparent ease with their childlessness, wondering if he felt the loss as keenly as she did. Now she understood he'd been carrying the same heartbreak, processing it privately in this sacred space. The journal entry for that painting revealed the depth of his hidden pain. October 20th, 1995. Marlene suggested we turn the nursery into my office. Make it useful instead of letting it sit empty. I agreed because it's practical, because she's right, because keeping the room as a shrine to what we can't have serves no purpose. But I needed to paint it first, to capture what it meant to us. Our hope lived in that room for 3 years. Now, I need to document its passing. The entry continued. Sometimes I catch Marlene looking through other people's children at church, at the grocery store, and I see the longing she tries to hide. I feel it too, that wondering about what our children would have looked like, whether they'd have had her quick mind or my stubborn streak. But we can't build a life on what isn't there. We have to find meaning in what is. Tears fell freely as Marlene read Harold's private thoughts about their shared loss. All those years, she'd carried her grief largely alone, assuming Harold had moved on more easily than she had, learning that he'd been processing the same pain that he'd understood. Her lingering sorrow, even when she tried to hide it, brought both comfort and regret. How different their healing might have been if they'd been able to share these feelings openly. The next painting showed their farmhouse on a gray November day. Bare trees stark against an overcast sky. But Harold had painted it from inside looking out, the warm interior visible through the windows, while the outside world looked cold and uninviting. The painting suggested safety and contentment, but also isolation, as if their grief had created a barrier between them and the larger world. She found more paintings from this difficult period. Harold working alone in the fields, the machinery looking too large for one man to handle, herself teaching at the school, surrounded by other people's children, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The two of them sitting at opposite ends of their kitchen table, the space between them feeling vast despite the room's modest size. These paintings documented the period when their marriage had grown quieter, more careful, when they'd learned to protect themselves and each other from too much vulnerability. Marlene remembered those years as a time of settling, of accepting that their life would be different from what they'd originally planned. But Harold's art revealed that he'd been acutely aware of every nuance of their adjustment, every small moment when grief had colored their daily interactions. December 8th, 1996. Emma Kowalski brought her new granddaughter to church today. Marlene held the baby during the service, and I watched her face transform. For those few minutes, she looked like the woman she might have been if things had been different. The baby fell asleep in her arms, completely trusting, and I could see Marlene imagining what it would feel like if that trust belonged to us. The journal entry made Marlene's chest ache with recognition. She remembered that day, remembered the weight of Emma's granddaughter in her arms and the bittersweet joy of holding a sleeping infant. She'd handed the baby back with what she'd hoped was gracious composure, but Harold had seen through her careful facade. I started a new painting when we got home, The entry continued. Want to capture the way Marlene looked holding that child, the love in her face, the natural grace of her movements. She would have been an extraordinary mother. Sometimes I think that's my greatest failure as a husband, that I couldn't give. And the one thing that would have completed her happiness. Marlene searched through the paintings until she found the one Harold had referenced. It showed her in profile, holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket, her face soft with maternal longing. Harold had somehow painted both her love and her loss in a single image, the tenderness in her expression coupled with the knowledge that this moment was borrowed, temporary, but it was the final painting in this collection that broke her heart completely. Harold had painted their anniversary dinner during their 10th year of marriage, not the celebration itself, but the moment afterward when they'd returned home and sat in their living room, the silence between them heavy with all the words they couldn't say. He'd captured the way they'd loved each other, but had struggled to bridge the gap that grief had created. The painting showed them sitting in their respective chairs, physically close but emotionally distant, each lost in private thoughts about the life they'd imagined versus the reality they were learning to accept. It was titled, Learning to Love What Is Instead of Mourning What Isn't. August 15th, 1997. The corresponding journal entry revealed Harold's determination to find a way forward. 10 years married today. We're different people than we were on. Our wedding day quieter, maybe sadder, but still here. Still choosing each other every morning. Marlene made my favorite cake, and we talked about maybe taking a vacation, visiting her sister in Colorado. We're learning to build happiness on a different foundation than we originally planned. That has to be enough. That has to be more than enough. Reading these entries, Marlene began to understand how Harold had used his art, not just to document their life, but to work through the emotional challenges that threatened to overwhelm them both. This studio had been his sanctuary, the place where he could honestly confront their disappointments and find ways to transform them into something bearable, even beautiful. She realized now that Harold's acceptance of their childlessness hadn't come easily, as she'd always assumed. He'd struggled just as deeply as she had, but he'd done his struggling privately, in this space where he could paint through his grief and emerge with renewed commitment to their marriage. His art had been his therapy, his way of processing pain and finding meaning in their changed circumstances. The unfinished canvas she'd noticed on her first visit suddenly made sense. Harold had been working on a painting of her in the garden, but he'd never completed it. The journal entry explained. Why? May 3rd, 2019. Dr. Patterson says the cancer is moving faster than expected. Time feels different now, more precious and more fragile. Started painting Marlene in her roses, but every brushstroke feels like goodbye. How do you finish a painting of someone when you're not ready to let them go? Asterisk a week into her daily visits. To Harold's studio, Marlene had developed a different relationship with solitude. What had once felt like loneliness now felt like communion with Harold's memory, with the artistic legacy he'd left behind, and with parts of herself she was only beginning to understand. But this morning, as she studied a series of paintings Harold had created during what she now recognized as the most difficult period of their marriage, she felt the weight of knowledge that couldn't be carried alone much longer. The paintings, from their middle years roughly 2000 to 2010, told a story she remembered living but had never fully acknowledged. Harold had documented the slow drift that had occurred between them, the way two people could share a house and a life while somehow becoming strangers to each other's inner worlds. One canvas showed their kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in 2003. According to Harold's careful notation, she sat at one end reading a stack of student papers, he at the other reviewing seed catalogs for the next season's planting. The space between them felt vast despite the table's modest size, and Harold had somehow captured the quality of silence that had characterized too many of their dinners during those years. Not companionable quiet, but the absence of connection. Another painting depicted her grading papers alone in their bedroom, while Harold watched television downstairs. The image was rendered in cool blues and grays, emphasizing the physical and emotional distance that had grown between them. She remembered that period, how they developed separate routines, separate interests, separate ways of spending their evenings. At the time, she told herself it was natural, the way long married couples learn to give each other space. But Harold's paintings revealed a different truth. This hadn't been comfortable independence. It had been loneliness shared under the same roof. The most haunting piece from this period showed her standing at their bedroom window during a thunderstorm, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. Harold had painted her from behind, her posture suggesting someone waiting for something that might never come. The storm outside seemed to mirror some internal turbulence, and the entire composition spoke of isolation and longing. She found the corresponding journal entry, April 15th, 2004. Another storm kept us both awake. Found Marlene at the window. Around midnight, just watching the lightning. Asked if she was all right, and she said she was fine, but I could see she wasn't. We've gotten so careful with each other, so polite. When did we stop telling each other the truth about what we're feeling? The entry continued with painful honesty. I wanted to go to her, put my arms around her, ask what she was really thinking about as she watched the storm. But I was afraid the answer might be that she was thinking about the life she might have had with someone else, the children she might have raised, the woman she might have become if she hadn't married a man who couldn't give her what she needed most. Reading Harold's private fears, Marlene felt a profound sadness for both of them. During those difficult years, she had indeed wondered sometimes about alternative lives, not because she regretted marrying Harold, but because the weight of their unfulfilled dreams had made her question whether they were enough for each other. She'd never spoken these doubts aloud, thinking they would be too hurtful to share. Now she realized Harold had been carrying the same uncertainties, the same gentle questioning of their choices. The phone's shrill ring interrupted her reading. Emma's voice carried the particular tone of neighborly concern mixed with curiosity. Marlene? Honey, I hate to pry, but I've noticed you spending an awful lot of time in that old barn lately. Is everything all right? You haven't been answering when I've called the house. Marlene found herself at a crossroads. For a week, she'd kept Harold's secret, processing the magnitude of his artistic legacy in private. But sitting here surrounded by evidence of the emotional isolation that had nearly derailed their marriage, she realized that some discoveries were too important to bear alone. Emma, she said carefully, would you have time to come over this afternoon? There's something I'd like to show you. Of course, dear. I was planning to make a casserole for the church potluck. Anyway, I'll bring you some. After hanging up, Marlene returned to the paintings with new eyes. She'd been so focused on Harold's artistic skill and the tenderness with which he documented their life that she'd initially missed the darker themes running through his work. But these middle-period paintings told a different story, one of a marriage struggling to maintain connection in the face of accumulated disappointments and unspoken grief. She found a painting titled Marlene's 45th Birthday, 1999, that perfectly captured the subtle sadness that had characterized her middle years. Harold had painted her blowing out candles on a homemade cake, but her smile looked forced, and her eyes held a weariness that she'd tried to hide from everyone, including herself. At 45, she'd been old enough to accept that certain dreams would never be realized, but young enough to mourn their passing keenly. The journal entry for that day revealed Harold's acute awareness of her struggle made Marlene's favorite German chocolate cake for her birthday. She said all the right things, smiled at all the right moments, but I could see the effort it cost her. 45 feels significant, somehow old enough to know better, too young to stop hoping entirely. I wish I knew how to give her the happiness she deserves. Another series of paintings showed them attending social gatherings, church functions, community events, harvest celebrations where they presented the image of a contented couple, while feeling increasingly disconnected from each other and their community. Harold had captured the way they'd learned to perform their marriage in public while struggling to find authentic connection in private. One particularly striking painting showed them at their nephew's baptism, surrounded by family members cooing over the baby. Harold had painted Marlene holding the infant during the ceremony, her face radiant with borrowed joy, while his own expression revealed the complex mixture of love and loss that such moments triggered for them both. August 12, 2001. David's baptism today. Marlene was asked to be godmother, and I watched her cradle that baby like she'd been born to hold children. The whole congregation could see what a natural mother she would have been. Drove home in silence afterward. What was there to say? Sometimes I think our childlessness is a wound that never quite heals, just scabs over until something tears. It opened again. As Marlene prepared for Emma's visit, she realized that Harold's art had done more than document their life. It had provided him with a way to process emotions that their generation had never learned to discuss openly. His paintings revealed a man grappling with profound questions about purpose, fulfillment, and the meaning of a marriage that had been forced to redefine itself repeatedly. But they also revealed something else: Harold's persistent love for her, even during their most difficult periods. Every painting, even the saddest ones, was rendered with the careful attention of someone who found her endlessly worthy of artistic consideration. He might have documented their struggles, but he'd never stopped seeing her as beautiful, never stopped believing their life together had value worth preserving. Looking around the studio now, Marlene began to understand that Harold's art hadn't just been about creating beauty, it had been about survival. This space had allowed him to process the disappointments and compromises that might otherwise have destroyed their marriage. By transforming their struggles into art, he'd found a way to love their imperfect life without pretending it was something other than what it was. The sound of Emma's car in the driveway signaled the end of Marlene's private communion with Harold's legacy. It was time to begin sharing this discovery with the world, to let others see the depth of love and artistry that Harold had kept hidden for so many years. But first, she needed to find the courage to speak about emotions and experiences that she, like Harold, had spent decades keeping carefully private. Emma's footsteps on the gravel driveway sounded different to Marlene. Now, not just the approach of a well-meaning neighbor, but the arrival of the first person who would witness Harold's secret alongside her. Marlene smoothed her hair and checked her reflection in Harold's small shaving mirror that hung near his easel, surprised to see that her face looked different somehow. The past week of discovery had changed something fundamental in her expression, added a depth that hadn't been there before. "Marlene, honey, what in the world?" Emma's voice trailed off as she stepped through the barn doors and saw the transformed space. The older woman stopped dead in her tracks, her casserole dish nearly slipping from her hands as she took in the scope of Harold's artistic legacy. "Sweet Jesus," Emma whispered, setting the dish carefully on Harold's work table. "Harold did all this?" Marlene nodded, watching Emma's face cycle through the same emotions she'd experienced a week ago: shock, wonder, confusion, and finally, a deep sadness for all the beauty that had been hidden away. Emma moved slowly through the studio, examining the paintings with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. "This one," Emma said, stopping before a portrait of Marlene reading in their porch swing. "This is how he saw you, Marlene. Look at yourself through his eyes." They stood together in silence, two widows contemplating the evidence of a love that had been deeper and more observant than anyone had known. Emma's presence made Harold's art feel less like a private revelation and more like a discovery that belonged to the world. "How long have you known?" Emma asked gently. "A week. I found the key in his toolbox and finally worked up the courage to use it." Marlene's voice caught slightly. "Emma, I lived with him for 35 years, and never knew he could do this. Never knew he saw me like this. Emma examined a painting of Marlene hanging laundry, the morning light catching the sheets as they billowed in the breeze. "Harold was always watching you," she said thoughtfully. "I remember noticing it at church, at community gatherings. While other men were talking about crops or weather, Harold's eyes would follow you around the room. I used to think it was sweet, how attentive he was. You noticed that?" "Honey, everyone noticed. That man was completely devoted to you, though I suppose he had his quiet way of showing it." Emma paused before a painting of their farmhouse during a winter storm. "But this ... this is something else entirely. This is like having a window into his soul." They continued through the studio together, Emma asking gentle questions about specific paintings while Marlene shared what she'd learned from Harold's journals. When they reached a section documenting their struggles with childlessness, Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I remember those years," Emma said softly. "How hard they were. For both of you. Robert and I went through something similar. Took us 8 years before we had our Sarah. And there were times I thought the wanting might break us both." She studied Harold's painting of the empty nursery. "But I never realized Harold was processing it like this. Men of his generation, they weren't supposed to feel these things so deeply." Marlene showed Emma the painting that had stopped her cold the day before, a portrait of a young woman she didn't recognize, rendered with intimate detail and obvious affection. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair and laughing eyes, painted against a background of autumn trees. "I don't know who this is," Marlene admitted, embarrassed by the jealousy that still tightened her chest when she looked at the painting. "It's the only portrait of someone other than me. And it's so ... tender. I keep wondering if Harold had feelings for someone else. Maybe before we were married, or..." "Oh, honey," Emma interrupted, moving closer to examine the painting. "Don't you see the signature? Look at the bottom corner." Marlene squinted where Emma was pointing and saw what she'd missed before. Not Harold's usual signature, but different handwriting entirely. The painting was signed H. Brennan, 1962. "This isn't Harold's work," Emma said gently. "This must be from before he started painting. Maybe something he bought or was given. Look at the style. It's completely different from everything else here." Relief flooded through Marlene as she examined the painting with fresh eyes. Emma was right. The brushwork was looser, the color palette brighter than Harold's typically. Muted tones. This wasn't evidence of Harold's secret affection for another woman, but rather a piece that had somehow inspired or influenced his own artistic development. They found more evidence of Harold's artistic education scattered throughout the studio. Books on painting techniques, correspondence with art supply companies dating back to the 1980s, and even a few letters from instructors at a community college 2 counties over. Harold had taught himself to paint through mail-order courses and library books, developing his skill gradually over decades of patient practice. "He never told me he was taking art courses," Marlene said, reading a letter dated 1987 from an instructor who praised Harold's natural eye for composition and remarkable patience with detail. "Maybe he was afraid you'd think it was frivolous," Emma suggested. Men like Harold, they were raised to think art was something impractical, not suitable for farmers who needed to focus on making a living. A journal entry from 1988 seemed to confirm Emma's theory. Marlene found the art books I ordered from the library. Told her I was researching barn paint colors, which was partially true. Don't want her to think I'm wasting time on foolishness when there's real work to be done. But I can't stop thinking about color and light, about capturing the way morning looks on her face when she drinks her first cup of coffee. Emma spent nearly 2 hours in the studio, examining each painting with the careful attention of someone who understood she was witnessing something extraordinary. When they finally returned to the house for coffee and Emma's promised casserole, both women felt the weight of shared discovery. "You have to show these to people," Emma said as they settled at Marlene's kitchen table. Harold was genuinely talented, more than talented. This isn't just folk art or a hobby. This is the work of a real artist. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Marlene admitted. It feels so private, so personal. Like I'd be exposing Harold's most intimate thoughts. But that's exactly why people need to see them, Emma insisted. These paintings show what love really looks like, not the Hollywood version, but the daily kind. The kind that notices and cherishes ordinary moments. In a world where marriages fall apart over small disagreements, Harold's art is proof that real love means seeing someone truly and finding them beautiful anyway. That afternoon, after Emma had gone home with promises to return soon, Marlene sat in Harold's studio as the light faded through the skylights. Emma's visit had transformed her experience of the space. It was no longer her private sanctuary for grief and discovery, but a gallery waiting to be shared with the world. She picked up Harold's journal and read one of his later entries. March 20th, 2018. Dr. Patterson says I need to start making plans, getting my affairs in order. What do I do with 30 years of paintings that Marlene has never seen? Part of me wants to destroy them, save her the confusion of discovering this secret after I'm gone. But they're love letters, every single one. Maybe she needs to know how beautiful she's been to me all these years. The entry continued. Maybe someday she understand that this studio was never about hiding from her. It was about finding ways to love her more completely than I knew how to express in words. Every painting was my way of saying, I see you. I cherish you. I find you worthy of all this attention and care. I just hope she can forgive an old man his shyness when the time comes. Reading Harold's hope that she would one day find and understand his art, Marlene realized that sharing his work wouldn't be a violation of his privacy. It would be the fulfillment of his deepest wish. Harold had wanted his love for her to be seen and understood, even if he'd been too humble or too shy to reveal it while he was alive. Emma was right. The world needed to see what Harold had created, needed to witness this testament to the kind of love that noticed everything and found it all worthy of preservation. 2 weeks after Emma's visit, Marlene had settled into a rhythm of sharing Harold's studio with her neighbor. Emma came by most afternoons, and together they had begun the delicate work of cataloging Harold's paintings, organizing them chronologically, and noting the corresponding journal entries. It felt like archaeological work, uncovering layers of a marriage that had been more complex and beautiful than either woman had fully understood while Harold was alive. On this particular afternoon, while Emma examined a series of paintings depicting their farm through the changing seasons, Marlene was exploring a corner of the studio she'd somehow overlooked in her previous investigations. Behind Harold's main easel, tucked into what appeared to be a custom-built compartment in the barn's original structure, she discovered something that would change everything she thought she understood about Harold's final months. The compartment was cleverly concealed, designed to look like part of the barn's original framework. It required pressing a specific board in a particular way to release the hidden panel. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth, were a handful of documents and a single envelope addressed to her in Harold's familiar handwriting. The envelope was thick, sealed, and marked with a date, to be opened if Marlene finds my studio. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal Harold had used, the same seal he'd always used for important farm documents, a small ceremony that lent gravity to whatever lay within. The letter inside was written in Harold's careful script, but the handwriting showed the slight tremor that had developed during his final months, when his hands had begun to betray the illness he'd hidden from her so carefully. My dearest Marlene, the letter began, if you are reading this, then you have found my sanctuary, and perhaps understand now what I could never find the courage to tell you while I drew breath. This studio, these paintings, this record of our life together, it was my way of loving you when words felt inadequate. my way of preserving the beauty I saw in our ordinary days. Marlene's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading. But it was the next paragraph that stopped her heart entirely. I have kept two secrets from you, my beloved, and both weigh heavily on my conscience as I write this. The first is this. Art. These years of documenting our life in paint and canvas. I pray you can forgive an old man his shyness, his fear that you would find my obsession with capturing your daily grace to be foolish or intrusive. A second secret is harder to confess. In October of 2019, Dr. Patterson told me that the cancer had returned and spread beyond what surgery or treatment could address. He gave me 6 months, perhaps 8 if I was fortunate. I chose not to tell you because I could not bear to watch fear and sorrow eclipse the contentment we had finally found together in our later years. The letter slipped from Marlene's fingers as the full impact of Harold's words hit her. He had known he was dying for months before his death, had carried that knowledge alone while she'd gone about her daily routines, unaware that their time together was running out with each passing day. Emma, who had been humming softly while examining paintings on the other side of the studio, noticed Marlene's sudden stillness. "Honey, what is it? What did you find?" Marlene couldn't speak, could only hand Emma the letter and watch her friend's face change as she read Harold's confession. When Emma finished, they sat together in the profound silence that follows a revelation too large for immediate comprehension. "He knew," Marlene finally whispered. "All those last months, when I thought he was just getting old, when I attributed his tiredness to age and his morning stiffness to arthritis, he was dying, and he knew it." Emma set the letter down carefully and pulled her chair closer to Marlene's. "Oh, sweetheart, what else does he say?" With shaking hands, Marlene retrieved the letter and continued reading. "I spent those final months in the studio, working to complete a record of our love that would survive my passing. Every painting became more precious, knowing it might be among my last. I wanted to leave you something beautiful, something that would help you understand how thoroughly you have been cherished, how completely you have filled my life with meaning. I painted you sleeping, Marlene, because in sleep you looked so peaceful, so trusting. I painted you working in the garden because watching you nurture life gave me hope for renewal. I painted our house in every season because it became home, only when you filled it with your presence. I painted our difficult years alongside our joyful ones because all of it, even the sorrow, was made bearable by sharing it with you." The letter went on to explain Harold's decision to hide his diagnosis. "You may be angry that I kept this knowledge from you, and your anger would be justified. But I've watched too many couples spend their final months focused on dying rather than living, seen too many marriages consumed by medical appointments and medications, and the desperate fight against inevitable loss. I wanted our last months to be about the life we had built together, not the death that was approaching. Instead of telling you about the cancer, I spent those months creating this legacy. Every evening I claimed to be checking equipment or planning the next season's crops. I was actually here, trying to capture on canvas what it has meant to love you for 35 years. I painted through my fear, through my sadness at the thought of leaving you, through my gratitude for the privilege of sharing your life." Marlene found herself sobbing now, the careful composure she'd maintained for 2 years since Harold's death finally cracking under the weight of this revelation. He hadn't simply died of cancer. He'd chosen to die privately, to carry the burden of his diagnosis alone rather than shadow their final months, together with fear and grief. But Emma was reading ahead in the letter, and her sharp intake of breath suggested there was more to Harold's confession. "Marlene, I need you to know that the decision to hide my illness was not made carelessly. I consulted with Dr. Patterson about the wisdom of secrecy, and we agreed that given the advanced stage of the cancer and the limited treatment options available, honesty might cause more suffering than kindness. I made detailed arrangements for your care after my passing. Financial preparations you will discover when you review our papers with David. More importantly, I made a different kind of preparation. The painting I never finished, the one on the easel by the window, it shows you here in this studio, discovering my work. I painted it in the final weeks of my life because I knew that someday you would find this place, and I wanted to be here with you when you did, even if only through art. Emma and Marlene looked simultaneously toward the easel Harold had mentioned, where the prophetic painting of Marlene's discovery waited as it had for 2 years, as if Harold had been watching over the studio even after his death, ensuring that his final gift would be found and understood. The letter concluded with words that recontextualized everything. Marlene thought she knew about Harold's death. I am not afraid of dying, my love, but I am devastated by the thought of leaving you. This studio is my way of staying with you, of ensuring that you never doubt how precious you have been to me. When you look at these paintings, you are seeing yourself through the eyes of a man who found you beautiful on our wedding day and more, beautiful with each year that passed. I hope that discovering this art will bring you comfort rather than confusion, joy rather than sadness. I hope you will see these paintings not as evidence of secrecy, but as proof of devotion too deep for ordinary expression. And I hope that someday, when the pain of my absence has softened into gentle memory, you will share this work with others who might need to see what love looks like when it pays attention. All my love for all of eternity, Harold. The hidden compartment also contained Harold's medical records from his final months, documentation of treatments he'd declined, and prognoses he'd faced alone. There were also detailed financial documents showing how meticulously he'd prepared for Marlene's future, ensuring she would be comfortable and secure after his death. But perhaps most remarkably, there was a second, shorter note dated just 1 week before Harold's death. Marlene, I'm writing this on what I believe will be one of my final visits to the studio. The pain is becoming difficult to hide, and I think you are beginning to suspect that something is wrong. Tomorrow I will suggest we visit Dr. Patterson together for my annual checkup, and I will allow him to discover what I have known for months. I am ready now to face this final challenge with you beside me, knowing that my true legacy waits here in this barn for you to find when the time is right. Sitting in Harold's studio, as the afternoon light faded through his carefully installed skylights, Marlene understood that her husband's death had been even more intentional and loving than she'd realized. He had orchestrated not just his artistic legacy, but the very timing of its discovery, ensuring that she would have enough time to grieve his passing before uncovering the depth of his devotion. Harold's final secret had been revealed, and with the full scope of his love became clear. He had been a man who loved so deeply that he'd chosen to bear terminal illness alone, rather than burden her with knowledge that could only cause suffering. His art hadn't been hidden from her. It had been prepared for her, a gift waiting to be unwrapped when she was ready to receive it. Asterisk. The weeks following Harold's letter transformed both Marlene's understanding of their marriage and her sense of purpose for the first time since his death. She found herself approaching each day with an energy she hadn't felt in years, driven by a mission that felt both deeply personal and profoundly important. Harold's art needed to be shared with the world. Emma had become her closest collaborator in this endeavor, arriving each morning with coffee and pastries from Miller's Bakery and staying until the afternoon light began to fade through Harold's skylights. Together, they had created a systematic catalog of his work, over 100 paintings spanning 30 years, each one carefully photographed and documented with its corresponding journal entry. "We need professional help," Emma announced one morning as they stood surrounded by their organizational efforts. "This isn't just a collection of paintings anymore, Marlene. This is a significant body of work that deserves proper presentation." Marlene had been thinking the same thing, though the idea of involving strangers in something so intimate still made her nervous. Who would we even contact? I don't know anything about the art world. My niece Sarah works at the museum in Columbus, Emma said thoughtfully. She studied art history in college and might know someone who could advise us. At the very least, she could tell us if Harold's work has the kind of quality that deserves a real exhibition. The phone call to Sarah led to a visit that would change everything. Sarah Kowalski-Chen arrived the following weekend, an energetic woman in her 40s with an art historian's trained eye and a curator's sense of how to present work effectively. Her initial tour of Harold's studio left her speechless. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said finally, using Marlene's formal name in the way that suggested she was struggling to contain professional excitement. "Your husband was extraordinary. This isn't folk art or hobby painting. This is museum-quality work, with a coherent artistic vision and remarkable technical skill." Sarah spent 3 hours examining Harold's paintings, taking careful notes and asking detailed questions about his background and training. When she discovered that Harold had been entirely self-taught, her amazement only deepened. The way he understood light, the composition of these pieces, the emotional honesty. "This is the work of someone with genuine artistic gifts," Sarah explained. "But more than that, these paintings tell a story that's both deeply personal and universally resonant. The way he documented your marriage, the honesty with which he approached both joy and sorrow, this could speak to anyone who's ever loved someone over a long period of time." By the end of her visit, Sarah had made a proposal that both thrilled and terrified Marlene. She wanted to arrange for a retrospective exhibition of Harold's work at the Regional Arts Center in town, with the possibility of additional showings. If the response was positive, "I think we should call it A Life in Paint, the Hidden Art of Harold Morrison," Sarah suggested. "The story of how you discovered his work after his death adds another layer of meaning. It becomes not just about his art, but about the secret ways people express love." Marlene found herself simultaneously excited and overwhelmed by the prospect. For 2 months, Harold's art had been her private discovery, shared only with Emma. The idea of exposing his intimate documentation of their marriage to public scrutiny felt both like a betrayal and a sacred duty. That evening, after Sarah and Emma had gone home to begin making arrangements for the exhibition, Marlene sat alone in Harold's studio with his final letter. She reread his words about hoping she would share this work with others who might need to see what love looks like when it pays attention, and realized that moving forward with the exhibition wasn't about exposing their privacy. It was about fulfilling Harold's deepest hope. She called her son David that night, something that broke their usual Sunday routine but felt necessary given the magnitude of what she was considering. "Mom, I don't understand," David said when she'd finished explaining about Harold's secret studio. "Dad was an artist? For 30 years? And you never knew?" "I know it sounds impossible, but he was remarkably careful about keeping it separate from our daily life," Marlene explained. "David, I need you to see these paintings. I need you to understand what your father was doing all those evenings he claimed to be checking on equipment." David's visit 2 weeks later provided the final validation Marlene needed to move forward with the exhibition. Her son, who had inherited Harold's practical nature and skeptical outlook, stood in the studio for 20 minutes without speaking, examining painting after painting of the life he'd grown up observing from the outside. "This one," he said finally, stopping before a painting of Marlene reading him a bedtime story when he was perhaps 6 years old. "I remember this night. I had the flu, and you stayed up late reading The Secret Garden until I fell asleep." He looked closer at the painting. But Dad wasn't in the room. "How did he? He painted from memory," Marlene explained. "Or maybe he stood in the hallway and watched without us knowing." The journal entry says he wanted to capture the way Marlene's voice makes stories come alive, the way she makes our son feel safe enough to sleep. David moved through the studio with growing emotion, finding paintings that documented moments from his childhood he'd forgotten, Marlene packing his school lunches, helping him with homework at the kitchen table, sitting in the bleachers at his high school baseball games. But what seemed to affect him most deeply were the paintings of his parents together during his teenage years, when he'd been too self-absorbed to notice the quiet affection that characterized their daily interactions. "I never realized how much Dad watched you," David said finally. "Even when I was living here, I thought he was just, I don't know, quiet, reserved. But these paintings show someone who was paying attention to everything." "He was always watching," Marlene agreed. "I just never understood what he was seeing." David's endorsement of the exhibition plan provided the final piece of confidence Marlene needed. If her son Harold's son could see the value in sharing this intimate documentation of their family life, then perhaps the broader community would understand it as Harold had intended, not as invasion of privacy, but as testimony to the depth of ordinary love. The preparations for the exhibition consumed the following month. Sarah coordinated with the Regional Arts Center to reserve the main gallery space for 6 weeks in early spring. Emma helped Marlene select which paintings to include, balancing the desire to show the full scope of Harold's work with the need to maintain some sense of privacy about their most intimate moments. They decided to include Harold's journal excerpts as part of the exhibition, printed on small plaques beside the corresponding paintings. This felt risky exposing Harold's private thoughts to public scrutiny, but also essential to understanding his artistic intentions. "The words are as important as the paintings," Sarah explained during one of their planning sessions. "They show that Harold wasn't just documenting your life. He was consciously creating art that celebrated the beauty he found in ordinary love." Marlene spent long hours in the studio during this period, saying goodbye to Harold's work in its original setting before it would be transported to the gallery. She had mixed feelings about the upcoming exhibition, pride in Harold's talent, excitement about sharing his vision with others, but also a profound sadness that he wouldn't be there to see the public recognition of his artistic gifts. One evening, as she sat among Harold's easels watching the sun set through his skylights, she found herself speaking aloud to his memory. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, Harold. I hope this is what you wanted when you wrote about sharing your work with others. I'm terrified that people won't understand, that they'll see it as intrusion rather than devotion. But I'm also beginning to believe that love this deep shouldn't be kept secret, even if you were too humble to show it while you were alive." The final week before the exhibition opening was filled with the last-minute preparations. The paintings were professionally framed and transported to the gallery, where Sarah and a team of volunteers arranged them chronologically around the main exhibition space. Marlene insisted on personally placing Harold's wedding ring, the artifact that had started her journey of discovery, in a small display case at the entrance to the exhibition. Local media had picked up the story of the hidden artist and his posthumous discovery, generating more attention than Marlene had anticipated. The newspaper ran a feature article about Harold's work, and the radio station interviewed her about finding the studio. Each interview felt like practice for the exhibition opening, helping her develop the language to explain Harold's art to people who hadn't known him personally. But it was the night before the opening, as Marlene stood alone in the gallery surrounded by Harold's life work professionally displayed under museum lighting, that she finally understood the full magnitude of what they were attempting. This wasn't just an art exhibition. It was the public unveiling of a love story that had been hidden for 30 years. Tomorrow, the community would see Harold Morrison not as the quiet farmer they'd known, but as an artist who had transformed his devotion into something beautiful enough to share with the world. Tomorrow, Marlene would stand before friends and neighbors and reveal the secret depth of a marriage they'd all observed from the outside, but never truly understood. As she prepared to leave the gallery, Marlene touched the display case holding Harold's wedding ring and whispered, "Tomorrow, everyone will finally see what I meant to you. Tomorrow, your love gets to be as public as it always was private. Asterisk. The morning of Harold's exhibition opening dawned clear and bright, the kind of early spring day that promised renewal and new beginnings. Marlene stood at her kitchen window, wearing the navy dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion, watching the sun illuminate the barn where Harold's secret had waited for her to discover. In a few hours, that secret would belong to the world. Emma arrived early, as promised, carrying a small bouquet of daffodils she'd cut from her own garden. For Harold, she explained simply, and Marlene felt her eyes well with tears at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. They drove to the gallery together, arriving an hour before the official opening to make final preparations. Sarah met them at the entrance, her professional composure barely containing her excitement about the evening ahead. "The response has been incredible," Sarah reported as they walked through the exhibition space one final time. "We've had calls from 3 other galleries interested in hosting the show, and a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch wants to do a feature story. Marlene, I think you need to prepare yourself for this to be bigger than we initially expected." The gallery had been transformed into something that felt both familiar and otherworldly. Harold's paintings hung under professional lighting that brought out subtleties of color and technique Marlene had never fully appreciated in the barn's natural light. The chronological arrangement told the story of their marriage with stunning clarity, from the joy of their wedding day through the struggles of their middle years to the profound contentment of their later life together. But it was the centerpiece of the exhibition that took Marlene's breath away. Sarah had arranged Harold's final painting, the prophetic image of Marlene, discovering his studio as the focal point of the main wall, surrounded by his journal entry, explaining his hope that she would find and understand his work. Seeing Harold's words displayed publicly, his private thoughts about love and art, and the fear of being misunderstood, made the exhibition feel like the most intimate conversation made suddenly, beautifully public. David arrived from the airport an hour before the opening, having flown in from Seattle specifically for the event. Seeing her son in his good suit, walking through the gallery with obvious pride in his father's artistic legacy, gave Marlene a surge of confidence about the evening ahead. "I keep expecting Dad to walk around the corner and be embarrassed about all the attention," David said as they stood before a painting of their family, Christmas morning from 1995. "But then I remember that he left these for you to find, which means some part of him wanted them to be seen." People began arriving 30 minutes before the official opening. Neighbors, former colleagues from the school where Marlene had taught, members of their church congregation, and farmers who had known Harold for decades. Marlene watched familiar faces encounter Harold's art for the first time, saw the moment of recognition when they realized that the quiet man they'd known had been observing their shared community with an artist's eye and documenting it with profound skill. Pete Morrison, the handyman who had helped Harold with farm repairs for 20 years, stood for a long time before a painting of Harold working in the fields during harvest season. "I never knew he saw himself like this," Pete said quietly when Marlene joined him. "This makes farming look like something noble, something beautiful." Dr. Patterson, now retired but still a pillar of the community, examined Harold's self-portrait with the careful attention of someone who had known the man personally. "Harold was always observant," he told Marlene. "During his appointments, he noticed things in my office that other patients missed, changes in my family photographs, new books on my desk. I should have realized that the level of attention to detail meant something more than casual interest." But it was when Marlene's former students began arriving, now adults with children of their own, that the full impact of the evening began to register. These were people who had known her as Mrs. Morrison, their third-grade teacher, but had never glimpsed the private woman who had been Harold's subject and inspiration for 30 years. "Mrs. Morrison," said Jennifer Walsh, now a young mother but once an 8-year-old who had struggled with reading, Seeing these paintings makes me understand why you were such a good teacher. You knew what it felt like to be seen clearly, to be worth paying attention to. As the gallery filled with visitors, Marlene found herself moving through the crowd like someone in a dream. Each conversation revealed another facet of how Harold's art was being received, how people were understanding not just his technical skill, but the love story it documented. The local pastor, Reverend Williams, stood before the painting of their 10th anniversary dinner, the one where Harold had captured their quiet struggle to reconnect after years of accumulated grief. "This is what marriage really looks like," he said to the small group gathered around him. "Not the honeymoon phase or the golden anniversary celebration, but the middle years when you have to choose each day to keep seeing each other clearly." By 7 o'clock, the gallery was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling out into the adjacent hallway and onto the sidewalk outside. Sarah had prepared for perhaps 50 visitors, but more than twice that number had come to witness Harold Morrison's artistic revelation. Asterisk. At 8 o'clock, Sarah called for everyone's attention and introduced Marlene for what they had planned as a brief welcome to the exhibition. But standing before the crowd of familiar faces, neighbors who had known Harold for decades, colleagues who had shared her professional life, young families who represented the future of their small community, Marlene felt compelled to speak from her heart rather than deliver the prepared remarks she'd practiced. "3 months ago," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, "I thought I knew everything there was to know about my husband of 35 years. Harold was a good man, a reliable farmer, a quiet neighbor, who minded his own business and helped others when they needed it. I thought our marriage had been solid and comfortable, built on mutual respect and gentle affection." She paused, looking around the gallery at Harold's paintings surrounding them like windows into a life she'd lived but never fully seen. "What I didn't know was that Harold had been documenting our life together with the eyes of an artist and the heart of a poet. Every ordinary day, every quiet moment, every small gesture I took for granted. He saw it all as worthy of preservation, worthy of celebration." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on her words as she continued. "I found Harold's studio by accident, and in it I discovered that the man I thought I knew completely had been keeping the most beautiful secret imaginable. He hadn't been hiding his art from me. He'd been creating it for me, leaving me a love letter written in paint and canvas that I would find when I was ready to receive it." Marlene moved toward Harold's final painting, the one that showed her discovering his studio. "This painting was completed weeks before Harold's death, though I didn't find his studio until 2 months after his funeral. Somehow he knew I would eventually have the courage to turn that key and walk through those barn doors. He painted my discovery before it happened because he wanted to be there with me, even after he was gone." The emotion in the room was palpable now. She could see tears in the eyes of people who had known Harold as the taciturn farmer, the man who said little but meant what he said. Emma was crying openly, and even David, who had inherited his father's reserved nature, was visibly moved by hearing his mother speak so eloquently about the love that had shaped his childhood home. "Tonight you're seeing Harold Morrison as he really was," Marlene continued. "Not just the farmer or the neighbor or the church member, but an artist who found profound beauty in ordinary love. These paintings prove that the deepest romance isn't about grand gestures or poetic declarations. It's about paying attention, about finding someone worth watching and never getting tired of what you see." She gestured toward the chronological arrangement of Harold's work. "Harold painted our struggles alongside our joys, because he understood that real love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to see beauty even in the difficult seasons. He documented our childlessness, our periods of emotional distance, our quiet disappointments, because he knew that love that can acknowledge sadness and still choose hope is the kind of love that endures." The gallery guest book which Sarah had positioned near the entrance, was filling with comments that revealed how deeply Harold's art was resonating with visitors. Marlene read a few of the entries aloud. "These paintings remind me to pay better attention to my own marriage. Thank you for that reminder, Mrs. Morrison." Harold's art shows that love is an action, not just a feeling. Thank you for sharing his beautiful vision with us. I've been married 42 years and thought I understood what commitment looked like. Harold's paintings show me I've only scratched the surface, but it was the final entry that brought Marlene to tears. Harold Morrison painted love letters to his wife for 30 years and never sent them until now. This exhibition is the most romantic thing I've ever witnessed. As the evening wound down and visitors began to leave, each one seemed to approach Marlene personally to share how Harold's art had affected them. Young couples spoke about wanting to pay better attention to each other's daily grace. Older couples reflected on the seasons of their own marriages that Harold had captured so honestly. Even single visitors found meaning in Harold's demonstration that ordinary life, observed with love, contained sufficient beauty to sustain a lifetime of artistic inspiration. The last visitor to leave was Mrs. Henderson, Harold's second-grade teacher, who was now 93 years old and living in the assisted care facility in town. She had arrived in a wheelchair pushed by her great-niece, determined to see the exhibition despite her frailty. "Harold Morrison," she said, taking Marlene's hand in both of hers, was always watching, even as a little boy. During recess, while other children played, Harold would stand by the fence and study the way light fell on the playground, the way clouds moved across the sky. "I used to think he was just shy, but now I understand he was learning to see." As Sarah locked the gallery doors behind them, Marlene realized that the evening had accomplished something she hadn't dared hope for. It had transformed Harold's private love into public inspiration. His art hadn't just been appreciated, it had been understood as he'd intended, as proof that ordinary love, sustained over time and observed with attention, could become something transcendent. Harold's legacy was no longer hidden in a barn. It was alive in the world, encouraging others to love with the same devoted attention he had. Brought to 35 years of marriage with the woman he'd found endlessly worthy of artistic celebration. 6 months after Harold's exhibition opening, Marlene stood in the barn that had once been his secret studio, now transformed into something entirely new yet deeply connected to its original purpose. The morning light still streamed through Harold's carefully installed skylights, but now it illuminated easels used by local residents who gathered twice weekly for the art classes. Marlene had begun offering in Harold's honor the Harold Morrison Community Art Center, as the hand-painted sign outside the barn now read, had become something neither Marlene nor Harold could have imagined during their quiet decades of marriage. What had begun as one man's private sanctuary for processing love and loss had evolved into a gathering place where neighbors explored their own creativity, while learning about the patient observation that had characterized Harold's approach to art. Emma sat at Harold's original work table, attempting her first oil painting, a simple still life of apples from Marlene's tree. At 72, she'd never considered herself artistic, but Harold's example had convinced her that art was less about natural talent than about the willingness to pay attention to the beauty that surrounded them daily. "I think I'm getting the hang of mixing colors," Emma announced, holding up her brush to examine the warm red she'd created. Harold's journal notes about color theory are like having him here teaching us himself. Marlene smiled as she moved between the easels, offering gentle guidance to the dozen community members who had become regular students. There was Pete Morrison, the handyman who had discovered a gift for landscapes that surprised everyone, including himself. Jennifer Walsh, Marlene's former third-grade student, now brought her 8-year-old daughter for the Saturday family sessions, creating art alongside the woman who had first taught her to read. Most remarkably, Dr. Patterson had joined the group. After his retirement, finding him painting a way to process decades of carrying other people's medical burdens. His portraits showed the same careful attention to human detail that had made him an excellent physician, translated now into an artistic medium that allowed him to celebrate life rather than simply preserve it. The exhibition had traveled to 3 other galleries over the past 6 months, each venue adding to Harold's growing recognition as a significant regional artist. A small book about his work was being prepared by a university press, with reproductions of his paintings alongside excerpts from his journals. But for Marlene, the most meaningful legacy wasn't Harold's posthumous fame. It was the way his example was inspiring others to look more carefully at their own lives. Mrs. Morrison called out Susan Chun, Emma's great-niece who had driven down from Columbus to participate in the weekend workshop. "Could you look at this painting? I'm trying to capture the way morning light looks in my kitchen, but something feels off about the shadows." Marlene examined Susan's work, recognizing in it the same impulse that had driven Harold, the desire to preserve ordinary moments that felt precious but fleeting. Harold wrote in his journal that painting shadows is really about painting time, she said, pulling out one of Harold's notebooks to find the relevant passage. He said shadows change constantly, so you're not just painting what you see, you're painting a specific moment that will never exist again. This had become Marlene's teaching method, sharing Harold's insights through his own words, letting his voice guide the creative explorations of people who had never known him personally, but were learning from his artistic wisdom. It felt like the most natural extension of their marriage, Harold's patient observation and gentle instruction flowing through her to reach others who needed encouragement to see their own lives as worthy of artistic attention. The afternoon session was interrupted by David's arrival from Seattle. He'd taken to visiting monthly since the exhibition, something that had strengthened their relationship in ways that regular phone calls never had. Harold's art had given them a new language for discussing love, commitment, and the beauty that could be found in sustained attention to family bonds. "The foundation paperwork is finalized," David announced, referring to the Harold Morrison Art Foundation they'd established to ensure the community center's long-term sustainability. "Between the painting sales and the donations we've received, we have enough funding to keep the classes running indefinitely." This practical support meant the world to Marlene, but it was David's personal transformation that moved her most deeply. Seeing his father's artistic legacy had awakened something in her son, not artistic talent necessarily, but an appreciation for the kind of patient, devoted observation that could transform ordinary life into something worthy of celebration. As the afternoon class ended and students began cleaning their brushes and preparing to leave, Marlene found herself alone in the studio for the first time in weeks. She'd taken to staying after each session, spending quiet time among Harold's remaining paintings and feeling his presence in the space he'd created with such care. She'd also begun painting herself, something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Her work was simple studies of the farmhouse in different seasons, portraits of the students who gathered in Harold's studio, still lifes composed of objects that held personal meaning. She would never have a Harold's natural talent, but she discovered that the act of painting was less about creating masterpieces than about learning to see with the kind of attention that Harold had brought to 35 years of marriage. Her latest painting sat on the easel where Harold had once worked, a portrait of the art class in session, with Emma concentrating on her apples, Pete examining his landscape, and Dr. Patterson mixing colors for his latest portrait. It was her attempt to document the community that had grown around Harold's legacy, to preserve this gathering of neighbors who had been inspired by his example to pay closer attention to the beauty in their own lives. As evening light began to fade through Harold's skylights, Marlene cleaned her brushes and prepared to return to the farmhouse. But first, as had become her custom, she spoke aloud to Harold's memory. "I think you would be amazed by what your art has become, Harold. It's not just hanging in galleries anymore. It's alive in the hands of people who are learning to see the way you did. Emma painted her first sunset last week, and Pete's landscape of Miller's Pond is so beautiful it made me cry. You wanted to show people what love looks like when it pays attention, and now they're practicing that attention themselves. She paused at the door of the studio, looking back at the space that had been transformed from Harold's private sanctuary into a community gathering place, while somehow remaining essentially what it had always been, a place where ordinary love was recognized as extraordinary, where daily life was understood as worthy of the most devoted attention. The farmhouse lights glowed warm and welcoming as Marlene crossed the yard. But for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't returning to an empty house. She was coming home to a life filled with purpose, creativity, and the kind of community connections that Harold's art had made possible. His love for her had become a gift to the world, and in sharing that gift, she had discovered a new chapter of her own story that she'd never thought she'd live to write.